So, dear God, as we continue our journey through this great book of your Bible, dear God, once again, just speak to us now. Give us something new from this great old story. Give us something new, dear God, that we can take within ourselves, within our hearts and our spirits, so that we can grow closer in our relationship with you. And we ask all this now in your holy, mighty, and very precious name. Amen. All right, now last week we finished up chapter 17 and we looked at several of the things about the act of circumcision, which was a mark of the covenant. We talked about Sarah getting her new name, from Sarai now to Sarah. And then we talked about the promise. Once again, the promise to Abraham. But as you notice, we finished up talking about how Abraham still wants Ishmael. He still thinks Ishmael should be the one. Even though God has already told him, no, it will be Isaac. But to give Abraham some comfort, what he did, you remember we talked about the fact that he still says, no, Abraham, he cannot be the one, but I'm going to bless him because he is your son. I will bless him. And we finished talking about all that and then how they took upon themselves that mark of the covenant into the chapter. So now let's continue on with the story of Abraham and Sarah and pick up with verse 1 of chapter 18. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. He looked up and saw 3 men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them and bowed down to the ground. He said, My Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree. Let me bring a little bread, that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant. So they said, Do as you have said. Now, I'm going to skip this next part, but basically what happens, he runs to Sarah, has her make 3 loaves of bread, he finds his servant, they kill a calf, and get everything ready as they prepare this nice big meal for these 3 men. Now pick up with me at verse 9. They said to him, Where is your wife Sarah? And he said, There in the tent. Then one said, I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife Sarah shall have a son. And Sarah was listening at the tent entrance behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. It had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, After I have grown old and my husband is old, shall I have pleasure? The Lord said to Abraham, Why did Sarah laugh and say, Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old? Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? At the set time I will return to you in due season, and Sarah shall have a son. But Sarah denied, saying, I did not laugh, for she was afraid. He said, Oh yes, you did laugh. All right, let's stop there. So now as we see here in verse 1, Abraham, as we're described here, resting under the shade of those oak trees there in the area of Mamre. The time is most likely right after lunch, following the noon meal, which back in the days of Abraham was something everyone practiced because this was the hottest part of the day. That time between 1 o'clock and 4 o'clock p.m., which back in that time was the smart thing to do because of the direct light of the sun. So what we figure now is simply this, that he must be in southern Israel. Must be in the south. Because this is something we've been doing ourselves also. We know how hot it gets following lunch, so he's a southern man apparently, all right? But then look at verse 2. As we read, Abraham suddenly, he does what? He sees what? These 3 men standing there in front of him. Which gives us the impression and the idea that these 3 men did not what?
Walk up.
They didn't walk up to where he was at. He didn't see him coming. He has no indication. All of a sudden, these 3 men are there. As he's sitting there in the front of the tent looking out, suddenly 3 men are there. But as we go on into this, What becomes the biggest thing, though, that should stand out to us, especially within the story there in verses 1 compared to verse 3? Now, in verse 1, the author, or let's say Moses, he lets us know what? That one of these three men is who? Is the Lord, or who? God. That this is God, or once again, the pre-incarnate Christ. But in verse 3, we see that Abraham, he doesn't know that one of these three men is who? God. He doesn't know that one of them is God. Now, how do we know this? Well, look again now. In verse 1, if yours is like mine, the author uses a capital what in describing God? If yours, okay, that's your editor, but that's good. That's even a better thing. I like that. But it's a capital what? Capital L or all four caps, okay? In writing the name or the title Lord. But now in the original writing, and I say this because some editors today can change this, but in verse 3, in the original writing, the author uses a small what? L, which is what the New Revised Standard is. It's a small L for the title Lord, which if it's a small L, a little L, it's not a reference to God, it's more just a reference to a person of a significance, of a title or something like that. Now, we point this out. The thing is this, in verse 3, we know there's something special about one of those three men. The one that's described as Lord. Because Abraham singles, there in verse 3, he singles out one of these three men. Now, we don't know, but we know he does it. Because here in verse 3, Abraham is talking directly to one of them. Talking to God, even though he doesn't know at this point that it's God. But he knows somebody is special. Because in verse 3, the verb that Abraham uses is what kind of verb do you think it is? It's a single verb, singular verb. That you and your is singular there in the Hebrew language. But then we get into verses 4 and 5. Here all of a sudden, Abraham changes. And he now begins to use the plural verbs. The plural verbs here, as he is now addressing all three of the men together. But Abraham knows. He doesn't know who he is, but Abraham knows that of the three men, there is one of them, something about one of them that makes this one stand out. He still hasn't learned what it is. But then as we also look at verse 4, what are now the two things that Abraham wants to do for these three men? In verse 4, he first off wants to bring them what?
Water.
Water. A little water so they can do what?
Wash their feet.
Wash their feet and rest. This is about cleaning themselves so you can rest properly. And then in verse 5, he's asking, let me also bring you a what?
Something to eat, bread.
A little bread. Let me bring you a little bread so you can eat and refresh yourself so you can then be what?
Fed.
Be fed and on your way. Notice that he says that. But like I said, what I skipped there, verses 6 and 7 and going into 8, as we see, Abraham, he runs to Sarah, tells her to make 3 cakes of bread, while he has the servant kill what we could call the fatted calf, if you want to call it that. One that was reserved for special occasions. The thing is, we point this out because what this shows us is this, that even though he's doing this, he actually, he says a little water and a little bread, what he ends up bringing to them is actually enough food to feed how many do you think? Several, a large crowd. This is enough food to actually feed a large crowd. But what Abraham is doing here is not unusual, okay? This was the actual custom in the way you treated a stranger who suddenly appears at your door. First off, you follow this specific procedure or a practice. You run to meet that stranger. You bow to the ground. And when it means that, it means he got on his face before them. He bowed, no, he just didn't bow toward the ground. He got on the ground. Okay? Before them. And then he honors them by inviting them. It was an honor to be invited into somebody's home. The second step is to provide water and bread to refresh yourself from the journey. Okay? But then you prepared and served a great meal. The thing is, you did it as quickly as you possibly could. Now, the thing is, all this is done with a purpose. Now, what do you think the purpose of this is? Is it meant to treat strangers better than how you treat your own family? I mean, it sounds like it, but no, that's not it. No, it's actually about two things. The reason why they do this. First off, it's about preparing, serving, and then giving your very, what do you think? Your very best. About preparing, serving, and giving the best of what you have to somebody. You didn't hold back, even to a stranger. This was their hospitality, okay? But secondly, in treating them this way, you are also showing true concern for their what, do you think? For their well-being, for their welfare. Strangers were treated like kings, basically. You know, because you were giving them your best and you were showing true concern for them while they're on their journey, okay? But then as we get to verses 9, as we get to the second part of this that I read, it's in this section that suddenly now Abraham is beginning to understand this is not just three men, three travelers who are now with him. He now begins to understand that this is either it's God with two angels in human form who are with him, or what other three people could this possibly be? What other three heavenly people could this be? Could this be God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit? It could be. We don't know. We do know that all three of them are very special. One stands out. But the thing is, most likely it's God, or what we call the pre-incarnate Christ, along with two messengers, two heavenly messengers, or two angels that are with him. Okay? But then, as we get into this section, there are a number of things then that begin to happen that open up Abraham's eyes. Look at verse 9. So what is the first thing that God does that begins to reveal himself to Abraham? He does it by doing what? What's the very first thing he does?
He calls, "Where is your wife?"
Okay, but how does he say it? Yeah, where is your wife Sarah? Okay? Now, what two things should stand out concerning this question? The first one, like Beth will point out, how does a stranger know what? His wife's name. But there's something else even greater here. How does a stranger know that Sarah no longer is called what? Sarai. Because it just happened a day or two ago. It's just a short period of time, they believe, that from when Sarai is now called Sarah. God is the one who did it. And now all of a sudden, here's the stranger not asking, where is good old Sarai that's always been with you? He uses her new name. So he's beginning to reveal himself, by using a name that she's been given just in a short period of time. But then he continues, look at verse 10. Because God, secondly then, begins to reveal himself to Abraham by doing what now? For the very first time. For the very first time, God is doing something for Abraham. He's giving Abraham what? Okay, now he's been giving him a promise. But what specific thing? A time. For the first time, God is now giving Abraham a specific time in which the promise of a son is now to be fulfilled. Remember, so far it's always been, you will have a son. I am going to keep the promise This is the covenant between us that shows we are going to keep this promise together, okay? But there's never been a time frame. He's never said 9 months from now. Well, now that's beginning to happen. He's now giving him a specific time in which the promise of the Son is now being fulfilled. But now here's where it begins to also get interesting. Because also now, as we continue on from these verses, we see Sarah is now doing what? She's now what? Well, not yet. First off, the first thing she does is she listens to the conversation. She's standing there listening to the conversation between her husband and these 3 men. And we know that she is staying hidden. She is back behind. Now, the walls of a tent were not going to be that thick. But the bottom line is, we know that she is hidden. She's staying out of sight because the custom back in this time was a married woman could not display herself in front of other men. That was the custom. A married woman stayed out in the back. So the thing is, we know that she is not coming out being a part of this, that she is in the background. But the thing is, as she hears what is being said about her having a baby, Sarah's reaction, Jack, is to now do what? She is laughing about it. Now the question becomes this. What was Sarah's reason for laughing at what is said? Okay. The thing is, we are told she laughs because she knew what? That she knew that she was no longer able to carry a baby, have a baby, not just because of her age, but because of her what?
She'd already gone through.
Okay, because of her what then? Her physical condition. She is beyond, it's not just an age thing now. Her body is beyond the ability to do this. She knew that she's no longer able to do this because of her age and her physical condition, okay? But very quickly, as we look at this, and she laughs, okay, there's one good thing that can be said about Sarah laughing at what has been said. That at least she didn't do what like Abraham did. Look at chapter 17, verse 17. When Abraham is given the news, he what? He starts laughing so hard he falls down on his face. That's, so at least Sarah didn't fall down on her face when she gets the news. But there's also verse 12, another little thing that can also stand out concerning Sarah laughing. And this is with God, or the pre-incarnate Christ. He points out about her laughing. What is it though that should stand out also? She didn't fall on her face like Abraham, but she also, what else stands out about the way she laughs? There in verse 12. She laughs silently to herself. She doesn't laugh out loud. She doesn't think, to speak out loud. She thinks to herself, which means what? No one could have heard her. It's not like she busted out laughing. She's laughing inside. She laughs to herself. And that's going to stand out. So remember that. But here where it starts getting good. Then look at verse 13. As we look at this verse, we now have another question. Was it Sarah's physical condition and age that caused Sarah to laugh when she heard what was said concerning her having a baby? Is it really the fact that she knows all this? What should stand out? To answer that question, answer this next one. Looking at verse 13, what should stand out concerning the question that God asked in that verse? What should stand out?
Is there anything too wonderful?
No, that's too far. That's 14. Look at verse 13. What should stand out? Something specific should stand out concerning that question.
You didn't do it out loud.
No, I'm talking about the question itself, though. Look at the question. Who is God asking the question to? To Abraham. Notice he asks Abraham. He doesn't ask Sarah why. He looks at Abraham and he asks Abraham, why is Sarah laughing? So what could asking Abraham why Sarah is laughing actually mean? Was Sarah laughing because this was the what? This could have been the what? This could have been the first time that she's heard anything about having a baby. It's very possible this is the first time that she has actually heard any news about this. Now, go back with me. Go if you want to. You don't have to, but you can go back to chapter 12 of Genesis. In chapter 12, Abraham, or Abram, is first introduced to us. As you go through from chapter 12, you get into chapter 15, and then into chapter 17. Now, these are the chapters. These are the parts of Abraham's story that were told that God either speaks to Abraham or he appears to Abraham how? Only. Each and every time he speaks or appears to Abram or to Abraham only. Not one time is Sarai or Sarah mentioned in the conversation that they have. Now, look at chapter 17, verse 16. Now, in chapter 17, 16, we pointed this out last week, okay? I will bless her. Well, look at 15. God said to Abraham, as for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her Sarah, but Sarah shall be your name. I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall give rise to nations. Kings, people shall come from her. You remember we talked about this last week, that this is the first time that God does what? It's the very first time that God included Sarah within what? The promise of a son to Abraham. But the thing is, even here in chapter 17, verse 16, just like all the other times here, God and Abraham meet to talk about this. What is said about the promise and the covenant are just between who? Him and God. Sarah is still not around. Sarah is still not part of the conversation. So does this mean that Abraham has kept all this from Sarah this entire time? If so, why do you think he would do that? Why do you think he would not tell Sarah? You know, and did he not have a responsibility to tell Sarah what God had promised both of them? We don't have an answer to that, either one of those. But it makes us think. But the bottom line is, it was really quite possible Sarah had no idea. Which changes what then? Do you remember a couple of weeks ago? We looked at what? Chapter 16. Flip over to chapter 16. Look at verses 1 through 6. Here concerns who? Hagar and the birth of who? Ishmael. Now, do you remember, I think this was 2 weeks ago, we worked our way through this chapter, and we said, what we talked about, or at least what I said, what I taught you was that the reason why Sarah was doing what she was doing, giving Hagar to Abraham, was because of what reason? Do you remember? There was a reason. And as far as Sarah was concerned, God had not done what?
Kept his promise to her.
God had not kept his word, his promise of delivering, giving her a child. God had not come through with his promise to give her a son. And remember we talked about that instead, as far as Sarah was concerned, if God is not going to do anything about keeping his promise, then Sarah is going to do what?
Take it in her own hands.
Take matters into her own hands. And as a result, we put all the blame basically on who? Not all of it, maybe, but we put 90% of the blame on who? That Hagar gets involved in Ishmael's born. We put the blame on Sarah. Okay? But think about it. If Abraham has not told Sarah about the promise and the covenant, then who's the one who's really to blame? Abraham. Abraham is, because the thing is, she's just doing what every woman who had no child is doing. The thing is, what verse in all of this should have given us a clue that maybe Sarah was not to be blamed for doing what she did? Which one of those verses in chapter 16? It's in the first 2 or 3 verses. There's one verse that should let us know, we should have understood. It should let us know Sarah's not really to blame for all that happened. What verse would you say? What verse may be there in chapter 16, within the first 3 verses? I'll tell you, it's verse 2. And Sarai said to Abram, you see that the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. If Sarah knew about the promise of having a child, would she have thought the same way concerning her inability to have a child? Would her statement more have been something like, since God has not fulfilled His promise to give me a child? And if this is the case, then Sarah actually did nothing wrong by giving Hagar to Abraham to have children for her. Because once again, this was the custom at the time for a woman to do something like this who didn't have a child. Which then, this takes us back. Let's go back to chapter 18, verse 13 then. There in 18:13, with God asking Abraham then directly this question, does this mean that God is now holding him accountable for Sarah's response? But the big thing is this: what is the ultimate telltale sign that this might actually be the case? Because as God is asking him this question, Abraham does what? God asks him the question, and Abraham does what?
Will I indeed have a child now that of my age?
Now that's Sarah. But look at verse 13. What does Abraham do, or what does Abraham say?
Why did Sarah laugh?
No, he remains perfectly silent, not saying a word. How many times have we got caught red-handed and you just stand there perfectly silent, not saying a word? That's what Abraham does. He doesn't say a word. He remains perfectly silent, okay? So maybe that's an indication that Abraham didn't do what he was supposed to do. But no matter what it is, now let's look at verse 14. Because God then shares, He does it in the form of a question, but it's within His question with both Abraham and Sarah. This is one of the most beautiful statements and beautiful truths about God that He makes about Himself that is found in the Bible. Now, the New Revised Standard Version says, is anything too wonderful for the Lord? The New International Version and the New Living Translation says, is anything too hard for the Lord? Anybody else got anything different? Either one stand out more than anything else? I have to share, I decided I wanted to look up and see if I can find some different ones. The Christian Standard Bible says, is anything impossible for the Lord? I like the Complete Jewish Bible. It says, is anything too hard for Adonai? That was beautiful. Or there's the Amplified Bible. Is anything too difficult or too wonderful for the Lord? Either way, it's a beautiful statement, okay? Beautiful reminder of who God is. But the question is, what does God really mean by this? Well, there's 3 ways to look at it. First off, now for that word wonderful, okay? The Hebrew verb here is pele. Pele. is used in this verse, and it can be translated to mean either to be wonderful, or it can mean too hard, or it can mean too difficult. But what is not understood concerning the word is this. They don't know. We don't know. Does this refer to the power of God's competence? To say nothing, is it too wonderful, too hard? Is this a reference to God's ability to accomplish something? Or is it about something extraordinary or marvelous concerning God? To me, personally, I can see it all three of those possibilities coming together. Because what it says is this, that in spite of this, the saying has become associated with this truth, that God's promises will not fail. God will always find a way, even when His promises concern the what? God keeps His promises. He'll always find a way, even when His promises concern what? The future. God will never break His promise. Because He has complete confidence. He has the ability to accomplish everything. He is extraordinary. He is marvelous. And that's just the beginning. And He will keep His promises. There's a second thing that's brought up. Since it is understood also to be a call, not just to Abraham and Sarah, but to all of us, to not allow our thinking or our reasoning to become too what? Our thinking, our reasoning concerning God should never be too what? Too narrow, I like that. Too what?
Too just offhand commonplace.
Offhand commonplace, which is also about what then? Too earthly or too what?
Unbelievable.
What'd you say? To know like a human. Our thoughts about God should never be too earthly, too human. What word you say? Too narrow, okay? You see, when it comes to God, our thoughts should always be focused toward what? God's divine what?
How wonderful.
How wonderful He is. Holiness, how holy. Toward His divine purpose, God's divine power. Or basically, it should be a heavenward focus. That's when it comes to God. Our thoughts should always be about how great our God is. But then there's the third way of looking at it, and this is my favorite. My favorite one of all. That what God says in His question strikes at the heart of the matter of what? The matter of what? Faith. God is saying is this, that since He is God, then why can't His promises be believed? Since He is God, then why do you and I not believe the promises that He makes to us? The thing is this is something I believe, what would change in our relationship with God? What would change in our daily life if every day, especially those moments when we're hit with a difficulty or a trouble, a hardship, if we would just ask ourselves, is anything too wonderful for the Lord? Is anything too hard for my God? What might change? What would begin to change in our lives and in our faith and in our relationship with God?
It would grow.
It would grow. But the thing is, it would do what? It would take our focus off the problems and put our focus on the one who can handle our problems. What would change if we started asking ourselves that question? Is anything too wonderful? Anything too hard for the Lord? For my God? Wonderful? Wonderful. Yeah. Anyway, whatever helps, Because like I said, there's a whole bunch of things that I looked up. Anything impossible. I like that. Is anything too hard for Adonai? I like that as well. But the thing is, then God reminds him a second time of when His promise will come to be. Now look at verse 15. Let's finish this up. Here we now reach what has become my favorite verse in all of this. What is Sarah's reaction to the question that God asked Abraham? I did not laugh. Which is actually what? It's the ultimate what?
Denial.
Lie. Okay, it's the ultimate human denial. Or our human response that we give, once again, when we're caught red-handed doing something that we wish we had not done. We either stand there and we don't say a word, or we deny that we even did it. Okay? But what is Sarah's real reason for why she denied laughing?
She didn't believe it.
Now, not that she didn't believe it. What is her real reason is there? She's afraid. What do you think she's afraid of? Because God has not shown himself this, I mean, even when Abraham is saying, oh God, why not Ishmael? God didn't get mad at him. He didn't hold anything against him. He just says, no, Abraham. Why is she, it's not like he's going to strike her down. She's a part of the covenant. She's the source of the promise. Why do you think she's afraid? See what now? Scared to carry the baby? Or maybe she is afraid that God's going to take his promise back to give her a child and maybe go ahead and use Hagar and Ishmael. Maybe that was it. But what really makes this my favorite verse is God's reaction to Sarah's denial. God says, what? Yes, you did laugh. And in my mind, I have a pretty good imagination. I can see that human face. But the way I like to see it, maybe a twinkle in his eye, a little grin on his face, as he lets Sarah know that he knows what she said. Is there anything wrong with seeing it that way? A little twinkle, a smile on his face. Oh, yes, she did. Just like when we do our children, But what is the lesson that we must learn and remember from what God says at this point? That we cannot what? Because remember, Sarah didn't say it out loud. She thought it all. So this means we cannot what? Can't con God, and you cannot what? Huh? It was more than just laughing. You cannot what? Oh, lie. I'm sorry. You cannot lie. You can't con God. But most importantly, you can't hide anything from God. God sees, hears, knows everything that we do and say, even when what we say and what we do is only done in our minds. God still knows what we've done. You can't hide anything from Him. And so let's stop here. We're going to continue on next week. We're looking in at the beginning of going into Sodom and Gomorrah. So continue looking at that. And what do you think is the reason between what happens, the exchange between Abraham and God when it comes to the righteous, okay? So what do you think about that? And because I learned something when I was younger, and I've now found out it was wrong. Just like the other thing about circumcision. So anyway, thank you so much to those of you who were here with us by our internet, by Facebook. Thank you so much for joining us. Hope you'll be back with us next week. Until then, take care and God bless. Goodbye.